a short fairy tale I'd like to share with you. And you all know how fairy tales begin?
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time, long ago, in a faraway kingdom, the king died, and the royal ministers called in the royal sculptor to create a heroic statue of the deceased ruler that would stand in the main square of the kingdom's capital city. Now, unbeknownst to the ministers, this artist bore several grudges against his late royal master. The king had commissioned work from him, but it usually wound up being placed in obscure villages or out-of-the-way places throughout the kingdom. Therefore, the sculptor accepted the task of creating a monument to the dead king, but he decided to do it in such a way that he would have his revenge. The statue he prepared turned out to be the masterpiece of his career. However, on the marble base of the statue, he carved his own name. Over that inscription, he then laid a coat of plaster into which, once it was dry, he carved the king's name. The statue was duly erected in the capital's main square to everyone's admiration. The years passed, and the weather took its toll on the plaster that bore the king's name. Eventually, the spring and autumn rains of scores of years accomplished their work. The king's name had disappeared, and the sculptor's name stood forth, carved in marble for all eternity. This, in fact, had been the sculptor's plan. Long after the king's name had been forgotten, his name would thus continue to appear in the public's eye. But 100 years after the artist's death, people would stroll by his magnificent statue of the king, bow to it, and tell their children stories of this beloved monarch who had lived a century ago. The children would invariably ask about the inscription carved on the base of the statue, the strange name that was not that of the beloved king. And the parents would simply reply that they had no idea who that was. The sculptor was consumed by revenge. He so thirsted and hungered for fame and glory. He wanted immortality above all things, and he got none of the above. He was certainly and simply was unfaithful to his call to be a humble sculptor, an honest artist, and he lost that which he desired so much. Our first reading that Lindsay read to us talks about that wandering Aramaean, our father Abraham, the father of faith, who found himself the father of so many people and thriving nation. Eventually, they were persecuted and put into slavery by the Egyptian people. And they cried and cried to God. And finally, God heard their voice and liberated them. And Moses took them by the hand and led them forth into the desert toward the promised land as free people. They wandered 40 years looking for that promised land, and they got tired. They started to complain, "Moses, are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And they got so tired and fed up that they weren't there, that they took matters into their own hands. They formed for themselves a golden calf, and they worshipped it in the desert. And they forgot about God. They forgot about the God who loved them so much and led them from slavery to freedom. The gospel today, Jesus finds himself in a similar desert. And as unfaithful as the Israelites were, Jesus was the new Israel, faithful. He's 40 days in the desert without food, and of course he's hungry. The devil appears and says, "You know, you're God. You can do anything. Change those rocks into bread. You can do it. He didn't. He said, you know, God has a plan for you, but the people already know that you're this famous Messiah. Bow down to me, and I'll make you that wonderful Messiah. No. He says, I can give you everything. Just fall off the temple if you want to show God just how powerful you are. Forget about God's power. Show him how powerful you are. And he says, no. Jesus was wise enough to know that he couldn't reason with Satan. There was no arguing. He simply said no and was faithful to the God who loved him, the God who gave him a mission, and he followed faithfully the mission God sent him. My sisters and brothers, we find ourselves on a mission to become great disciples of Jesus Christ, to become the wonderful followers, his presence here on this earth. And we find ourselves tempted sometimes. Yes, we want our needs met, but sometimes we want our wants met as well. We want fame, fortune, wealth, acceptance, and sometimes we compromise ourselves and we follow Satan's way rather than God's way for each and every one of us. This is the season of Lent. We find ourselves in the desert during this Lenten season. And it's not about us. It's about God. It's about getting rid of what's inside of us that doesn't belong, that's not of God, to make ourselves better disciples. You know, it's all about penance and trying to do things that we give up for Lent or do better things during Lent. It's not the quantity so much as it is the quality. It's about conversion, being that much more of the likeness of God here on this earth. When the end of Lent comes and Easter comes, if we follow God's plan for us, we'll be able to yell out the renewal of our baptismal promises when we do that on Easter. When it comes to the end of Lent, though, on that statue that we erect, will God's name be on there, or will